Hi, back again for part two of our snail shell modeling tutorial. We're going to look at texturing this object. So if you remember, we created this using the animated sweep, um, and we output a NURBS object. Now you could have output a polygon object and the same thing will hold true, but we can just use the NURBS object here. Now, one thing you have to remember about an NURBS object is that it has implicit UV coordinates. So even though this is a complex shape, you remember that every single NURBS object is just a plane, a flat four-sided patch that is warped into this shape. So you can imagine that this is a plane that's wrapped into a cylinder, then twisted around. But because it all starts out as a plane, the UV coordinates, the UV 0 to 1 space, is just shaped the same as its original shape. No matter how it's deformed, the UV coordinates stick to the surface. So with this object selected and I go to the UV texture editor, you see there's nothing I can select here. I can't go into UVs and select them. I can select them here, or I can show them here in the 3D world, but I can't select them and move them in the UV texture editor. That's because they're implicit, they're tied to the surface. But that's fine, we're going to take advantage of that. We're going to create a texture for this object that looks something like this, although I was just making this up as I went along, so probably end up with something quite different. But none of this is painted on. It's all procedurally derived, mostly using ramps, which are one of the most useful in textures that are available, procedural textures. There is one photographic reference in here. This kind of spotty texture is a texture I downloaded off the internet. You can take your own photos or whatever. You don't have to rely on photos or painting. You can just use procedural textures for this. But let's go through and create this object. So I'm going to open my Hypershade here. And so this is what we're going to wind up with if we just look at my network. So all I have really is just a few ramps to make some noisy pattern. Here's that photographic reference. It's feeding into the bump and the color channels. And that's all I really did for this, just bump and color. But you could paint or do something in the specular highlight channel, but you don't really need all that stuff. So let's create something brand new. I'm going to start with a blend and map it out, and I'll apply that to my object. And I'm going to bring in the that file that I was talking about. So just create a file node, just move it over here. Ceramic tile close-up. And I'm not going to pipe this straight into the color channel. Well, I will for now, and then so we can just see how it looks. So if I do a render, you can see that it's a little bit streaked around here, because remember that we can see what the U and V directions are on this object if we select it and go to Display, NURBS, Surface Origins. Just go to Form Mode here. So you can see this red line going around and the little red U there. That indicates that the U direction is going along the length of this object. And it's kind of hard to see, but around the opening of the snail shell is a thicker green line, and there's a little V somewhere. It's right here, and that indicates that the V direction is going around the circumference of this object. And the blue line is the Z direction. So you can see that the V direction is much smaller than the long U direction, so we may want to repeat this a few times in U. So just selecting the Place 2D Texture node for my object and repeat in U, maybe change it to 10. Oops, not 610. 10. Maybe that's a little bit too much. 5. There. So we can, let's just get in a little bit closer here and render this. So this is what it's like repeated 5 times in U And if I just go back to the default one and render it, this is what it looks like. So not stretched, stretched. So 5 is a good amount. But I don't want just this texture on it. I want to maybe have some bands of color going around. So I'm going to use a ramp for that and a layered texture node. So let's just create a ramp here. Let's move it out of the way, try and keep things organized. And a layered texture node. This is just a way to take different textures and combine them using different blend modes, just like in Photoshop. So to do that, I can just double click on the layer texture node and drag the ramp into here, drag the file into here. So anything on the left is going to be on top. That's why you can see my ramp is overriding the file. But let's just create the ramp node right now. So I'm just going to make it black and then choose a color for my stripes, maybe a kind of, let's have blue stripes. Tighten this up a little bit, give it smooth interpolation, and I'm going to pipe the layered texture into the color channel. We'll do an IPR render. Oops, what to do with my software. So you can see we're not seeing anything yet. That's just because we have one stripe. So let's, and remember this is a V ramp, so let's see if that's going to work. So increase the number of repeats so you can see the ramp has changed here. So we've got stripes going around there. Okay, we'll have stripes going around that way. Maybe not quite so many. Maybe a little bit more. Okay, and maybe tighten them up just a little bit. Okay. And I'm going to add a little bit of noise, oops, in the ramp node, just so they're not perfect stripes, so they get broken up a little bit. You can always rotate them a little bit if we wanted to, just to change them. But no, I think I like it the way it is. A little too noisy, maybe. Now, one thing I don't really like is the way they come together here in the end. So I'm going to change this a little bit. I can also tighten it up again. Maybe something like that. But if I want to get rid of the nature of this stripe as it goes into here, I'm going to create another ramp and put a ramp within a ramp. So I'm going to break this connection for now. And this ramp, I'm just going to have it black at one end. And have, so the bottom end, I want the first ramp instead of a color. So I'm going to put the first ramp here. And you can see that, so it's just fading out to black towards the end. So I can move this up. Now I'm not positive I have this in the right direction. It has to be a U ramp. It has to be opposite the direction. And I have to reapply it. Not sure that this is working yet, so let's just take a look. Yeah, so you can see I'm having the lines fade out a little bit when they get towards the end. If I wanted to have them fade out at the beginning, I could put another black point here. But I don't want to do that. I just want them fading out towards the end just a little bit. so we don't get them going right into going there. Oh, why did I do that? Let's open that again. Okay, so we've got the stripes working the way we want, but we can't see the file texture underneath it all. So let's change the blend mode. So select the ramp, and let's give this a name so we don't forget what we're doing here. Call this blue stripe ramp faded. And we'll call the first one blue stripe ramp. Alright. So in the layer texture with the ramp selected, we can change some of the blend modes here, and just to take a look at what we're going to get. So we can add the values, so it's going to lighten things. We can subtract, we'll get the opposite color. That kind of looks interesting actually. Different, multiply, difference, obviously weird. And then we can lighten. We're losing a lot of the fall off. If we wanted to use that, we could always just open these up a little bit, but it makes it look too glowy to me. Let's just try these different things. Do something like desaturate. Of course, I could always reverse the color to get it back to blue. Just go across the color wheel here. Let's just do something like that. I'm going to increase the noise a little bit in the ramp itself. Not in the placement, but just in the ramp. Just to break it up a little bit, just to make it a little more interesting. Something like that. Now let's make some color going across this way, maybe a brown color. And of course, because this is procedural, you can do this and then make changes to anything. Now, I don't want this tutorial to go on forever, so I'll try and hold myself back a little bit. So let's just give it kind of a, again, sort of brown color. Whoops. And this will be a U ramp? No, a V ramp. So we're going to repeat it maybe 10 times. Is that right? No, this should be a U ramp. So it be repeated in U 10 times. And we can also put this in the layered shader. Using the middle mouse button to drag these things around. Tighten this up a little bit. Grab that color. So we get something like that. I'm just making this up. To kind of get stripes going around this way. And again, we'll have to change the blend mode so these things work together. Oops, wrong one. Do something like add or subtract. That kind of looks interesting. Can multiply if we want to get that color, but then we'll just have to change these black to white if we want to retain the original color to get something like that. And again, I'm going to add a little noise just to make it kind of more natural looking. I want to point out something here. You can see, let me just zoom in on the picture. You can see there's sort of a discontinuity here in the texture. And that's because that's where the seam on this object is. Now you remember that a NURBS object is just a flat plane that's deformed into a different shape. So the two edges have to meet somewhere, and you can see with surface origins turned on, you can see that here's the seam here. If I turn off surface origins, you can still see a thicker green line here, and that indicates that's where the seam is. So let's move the seam somewhere where we're not going to see it. Grabbing one of these that would probably be blocked by the actual snail itself. Maybe just right click, grab this isoparm, go to edit NURBS, and just move seam. Does some weird stuff to your model, and then now when we do an IPR render, it's much better. So it's still kind of flat looking. So let's add a bump to this. So for the bump, I'm going to use another ramp, plus I'm going to use this original texture. So I can just drag this over just to see what it looks like. Add a bump map. Bump maps are always too high when you start. And so it's adding a nice bump. Now it always looks a little exaggerated in an IPR render because it's not anti-aliased. If we actually do a real render, it looks a little more subtle, but still a little too high. Go down something much less. Okay, something like that. But I also want to do sort of spiral bumps going around. So I'll use another ramp to do that. So I'm going to delete this bump node for now. Create another ramp. And create another layered texture so I can combine these two different textures into one bump. So I want to drag this one in, and then the ramp. So the ramp is just going to be black and white. Black will be no bump, white will be a bump up. And again, I want this to be this one should be a U ramp, but I want to repeat it lots of times. 50, let's see. Just for testing purposes, I'm going to put it on top so we can see it, and I'll attach this layered texture as a bump map here. Okay, so it's working. I mean, it looks terrible, but it's doing what we need it to do. So go back into the ramp and maybe smooth the interpolation. And also I'm going to add some noise again. So you can see we get nice broken up ridges there. And of course the bump is too high. That's better. Still kind of high. Good, that's better. But still I want that other texture to show through. So in the layered texture node, I'm going to go in and I can change the blend mode. So it will have that kind of bumpy texture. I can add them together maybe to get the bumpy plus the ridges. Maybe I want to space out those ridges a little bit more. I can do that just by going into the ramp node, adding a little more black space between them. And if I feel that this one, if I want to control the bumpiness of each individually, I can't just use the bump depth because it will affect both. I can go into, say, the file node, and in color balance I can affect its alpha gain if I want this one to. Very interesting. Well, maybe you can't do that, but I thought you could. Can I do it in the ramp node? By affecting the alpha gain. Maybe it doesn't work in IPR. Let me do a regular render. Put it in the bucket. And go to that file node again. Nope, makes no difference. Very interesting. But I could go in here to this ramp, and instead of making it white, I could make the middle color sort of gray, and that will also reduce the bumpiness of that. So I can't affect it individually that way. I don't like that blue line anymore, so I'm going to go in and change this ramp. Oops, that's my fading ramp. Which one is it? This one. Just going to make it white. Yeah, maybe just make it like that. And in fact, I want to make it a little wider. Whoops. Just give it a little more interest. And then I can always go into that layered shader, and I can just turn down its alpha, sort of just to turn down its volume, so it's just not as clear. Okay, so let's say we're happy with that. That looks pretty good. Of course, this is a pretty low quality render, but one thing you will notice is that it's really chunky looking render, and this is something you have to consider when you're rendering a NURBS object. Another problem is the intersection of this geometry. Now, I don't know how snail shells actually work, if this sort of brown splotch should continue seamlessly over the shell, if they should match up. And you could, if that's true, then you could arrange it so that happens just by changing the repeats in the UV and stuff. But it's this harsh edge here. And there's not much I can do about it without doing some more construction to soften that edge. But what I think I'll do later on is just to render it with an ambient occlusion pass that will just darken up this edge, and that will hide some of this stuff. So I'm going to leave that alone. But when you're rendering a NURBS object, it's not quite like rendering a polygon object where you smooth it until you get a nice smooth result. For a NURBS object, you have to set its tessellation attributes. So let's do that now. So if I just go into object mode here and look at the shape of the shell, I should probably name this shell tutorial. And so the shape node of this, you can see there's something called tessellation here, and I can turn on display render tessellation. What tessellation means is that tessellation means triangulate, or to turn into polygons. So at render time, all objects have to be turned into polygon objects, whether they start as NURBS or subdivision surfaces or whatever. By default, Maya does a really low res version of a NURBS object, so you can see that it's really chunky, but we can go in and turn on enable advanced tessellation. You can see it's already doing a better job, and then we can go in and just change these values here. So we can just use the default method and just turn up these values, so how many divisions it's going to make based on the number of isoparms. So I'm just turning it up until I see this surface looking smooth, and then I can render that. So that looks much better. So anyway, there you go. If you take some time, you can make something much better looking than I did in terms of the texturing. But everything was done, almost everything was done with procedural textures, so you can go in and make changes to these things, and it's quite easy. I didn't have to do any UV mapping for this, which, as you're probably aware by now, is a big time saver and really helps. So go ahead and make a snail shell. Thanks.